Now, before we work on the loading state of this modal, the create shortened link modal, we will be working on the validations. We need to validate the values of these two input fields that we have over here, because right now the user can keep them empty and they can still create a shortened link as such, although it doesn't make any sense, but it is something which is possible. So we have to ensure that it doesn't happen, and we will be doing that by adding in validations. So we will be adding validations on both the ends, on the front end, which means that the web application that we are building, as well as in the backend, and by that I mean the security rules of Firestore. So the reason why we want to do that, the reason why we want to add the validations on both the ends, is because we cannot just rely on the front end as it is the client side. It is possible for the user to modify the request and bypass the validations that we will be adding. So that's possible if we just validate it on the front end. And in order to kind of ensure that even if they modify the request, that request doesn't succeed, like the document is not added, the document doesn't get added within the database, because we have certain checks over there as well. And the other reason why we don't want to do the checks only in the backend is because the security rules, they work in a way that we structure the rules in certain way that certain conditions are met. And if any of those conditions are not met or they fail, the request in itself will be failed, like the request will not succeed. So the thing is, using Firestore, we cannot return back a custom error. It's more of like a generic error which says that the request failed, the permissions, like the user doesn't have the required permissions, something like that. The point is, we cannot provide a custom error message stating that why exactly the request failed. Like we cannot send back an error saying that the name field cannot be empty. So that's one of the case which we cannot do that using just the security rules. So that's the reason why we will be adding the validations on both the ends. So let's do that first. So within the project, within the shorten URL modal, this thing, now in order to show the error message, we can do it the same way that we did with the auth modal, which is by showing the message somewhere around here. But this time let's actually let's use a different way. So on the text field that we are using over here as the input component, there's actually a prop of error which takes a boolean value, and we can use this to change the state of the input element. So if I just pass in this prop, which implies that it's true, it's going to make it as red, as you will see over here. And we can also display a message below the input field by using the helper text prop, which takes a string value. So we can kind of show a message like the name should be minimum 3 and max 15 characters, something like that. You can come up with a creative message. The point is, if we do that, we will be seeing the message as such, which is kind of descriptive, and it does state where exactly the thing went wrong. So yeah, we need to do this, and for this we need to have a state. Let's do that. Over here at the top, we will be creating a state for the errors and the function to be set errors, and it's going to be an object containing the same fields, the same structure as of the state, which means that as of this form state that we have over here. So we kind of need to add in these two fields as well. So the thing is, these two fields, they will be containing the error message. If they are empty, which is the case by default, it means that there is no error. But if there is a string value, it means that there is some error, and that string value is the message that we need to display. So let's do that over here, where we are calling the handle submit and we are making the request. So over here we should be creating a variable with the name of errors, just so that we have a local variable which we can mutate and we can add in the errors, and later we will be updating the state using the set errors and passing in this error object that we have over here. So now we just need to do the checks, and before that we also need to trim the values. We need to trim them out as they may contain some extra spacing in the beginning or in the end. So for that, over here we can name it as T name, a short form for trimmed name, and we just need to call the trim function on that specific state value, which is form.name.trim, which will remove the extra spacing. So we need to do the same thing for the other one, which is T long URL, and it's going to be T, well, not this, long URL in such a way. So now we just need to do the checks. Let's do that. Using the if statement, we will be checking that if the trimmed name is, if the length of it, the string value, the length of the string is less than 3, and the same thing if it is more than 15. In that case we want to show the message. So on this error object that we have, we can add in the, we first need to tap inside the respective property, which should be the same as of the field name. So as we are checking the name, it will be errors.name as such, and this will be the error message. So let's do the same thing. The name should be minimum 3 and maximum 15 characters long as such. And we need to do the same check for the long URL. Well, actually for the long URL, we just need to check whether or not it's a valid URL, and we can do that by using a regex. Let's take a look. URL regex, something like this. Over here, so we don't want to check that thing as we are adding the protocol ourselves. So yeah, I think this should work. Let's actually copy this thing. I will be providing the same regex in the resources section, or you can kind of Google it by yourself, and you do know that it's the first link. So let's just copy the same thing, heading back to the project. Over here we can place the regex at the top, and now we just need to use it. Well, actually one more thing before we use it, I will be adding it over here. So on this regex we have a method of test, and we can provide any string value, and if it matches, it's going to be like, it's going to return a boolean value stating whether or not it matches the regex. So if I pass in something like this, it's true. What about the special characters? It's false. Perfect. What if we pass in the protocol? That's great. And what about the spaces? So that's perfect. I think this should work. Let's use it over here. And within this, if we can check using the regex that we have over here, that if the trimmed long URL, if this thing is true, which means that the URL is fine, it's validated, but we need to check the opposite. So for that we can add in the exclamatory mark before it, and over here we can, if this is the case, if it doesn't match, we can add in the property of the long URL with a message of URL is not valid or is invalid, something like that. So over here we just need to check that if this object is empty, this error object, if it's empty, it means that like everything is fine. So we can continue with the call of adding the document within the database. But if it's that, If that's not the case, then we need to update the state. So for that, we can use another if statement where we can use the object dot keys, which returns back the keys of the object within an array. So we need to pass in the error object as such, and if the length of it, if it is more than 0, which means that there are some errors, then one second, so this thing will be true. So I think we do need to, what about, okay, so I think we need to add in the double exclamatory mark in order to coerce the value. So if this thing turns out to be true, which means that there are some errors in this object, then we just need to return the function so that we do not continue with it, and we need to update the state of the set errors using the set errors function and passing in the errors as such. If we do that, and let me just log the errors to the console as such, and if we take a look, let's see, well, one more thing, we can comment these two out for the time being. So if we take a look, as you can see, the error state is currently empty, but if I just submit, it says that URL is not valid. What about the name? I think there's something wrong. Well, it has to be or, I think. Yeah, it has to be or, which means that if the name is less than 3, or if it is more than 15, in that case we do want to show this message. I'm still not quite sure. Let's see. So if I click on it, that's fine. What about if we add in just 2 characters? We still have the message. How about 3? So that's perfect. And if we add more than that, so I think that's working. Yep, that's working. So yeah, now we just need to use this state, this errors, in order to show them on the respective text field. So over here, we need to pass in the error prop on both the text fields, and this thing should be true if there is actually, like, if the string value is not empty within the errors object, this thing, not this thing. So we can make sure that, one second, so it will be true, like if it's an empty string, so if we add in the exclamatory mark, it will be true. So we can do the check that if the errors, which is errors dot name, if this is true, then the state should be true, but at the same time we want to show this message only when the error is true, because even if we pass in the helper text without the error, it's going to show the message over here, and we don't want to do that. We only want to show this message when there is actually an error for that thing. So for that, what we can do is kind of need to do the same thing. Okay, wait one second. If this is true, well, actually we need to add in the double exclamatory mark. I just noticed this thing. So if it is true, then the error state, then there is some error, otherwise there is not. And for the helper text, what we can do is, okay, so for the helper text, we can kind of do the same thing. We can use the same boolean value in the same way, and if this is true, then we want to show this message, like then we want to set this text as the message. Well, actually one more thing, we don't really need to do this thing, as we do have the message within the errors object. I kind of missed that thing out. So we just need to point that the same error state, the same value within the errors object. So let's do the same thing for the other text field that we have over here, where it's going to be the long URL as such. So if we do that, let's see, let me just refresh, and if we open the modal, that's fine. If I click on it, that's beautiful. Let's enter something. If we enter 3, this thing is false. Perfect. And for the URL, it has to be the same thing. So that's great. It means that the validations are working, and now the user should be providing the right values. So that's great. Now, just a side note that there are many different ways in which you can kind of validate these input fields. There's actually a library as well, which is something like React hooks form. So like you can use that, but in our case, as there are just 2 input fields, I don't want to kind of introduce new things just to handle these 2 input fields. So for the time being, this thing will work perfectly fine. And at the same time, there's one more thing that over here, now we need to pass in the trimmed name instead of the actual value within the form state. So let's pass in the t name and the t long URL in such a way. And I think that will work perfectly fine. Even if we add in some spacing, that's fine. Like, oops, nothing. Great. Perfect. Now that being done, we will be working on the validations on the security rules later. For the time being, I think that's it, which means that there's one more thing off the list, and now we just need to work on the loading state. So let's do that.